while Israel has an army and it will defeat Hamas and it will defeat Hezbollah, a massive war is being unleashed throughout the world against Jewish communities, not just on the campuses. We saw it in countries spanning from the United States to Dagestan and Turkey and the UK and Europe. Nobody in the Jewish community seemed to understand that massive resources, if they're going to be raised now, they need to go to the diaspora, to fighting a battle. In fact, the diaspora didn't even seem to understand that war had been launched against it.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. When the sirens started on the morning of October 7th, Israelis realized they were under attack. But they were not alone, because Hamas's barbaric massacre set off a wave of celebrations around the world, and the whole Jewish diaspora came under assault. The October 7th massacre was the opening shot of Hamas's war on Israel and the trigger for what we can only call a global war on the Jews. After Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran itself, the attacks on Jews around the diaspora are the eighth front of this war. A global war on the Jews. That's the subject of David Hazony's prophetic essay, The War Against the Jews, published in Sapir Journal just 1 month after 10/7. Hazony's essay is truly a classic for the ages. A stark warning of the true global threat to the safety and security of Jews, wherever they may be. We'll share the link in the podcast notes, and I encourage you to read the original essay, an urgent wake-up call, and an action plan for the whole Jewish world to work together in lockstep in self-defense. Because all hope is not lost, and there are superheroes who live among us and are ready to take up the mantle. David Hazony is an award-winning editor, translator, author, and now director and senior fellow at the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities. His latest work, Jewish Priorities, 65 Proposals for the Future of Our People, brings together an array of new voices from across the Jewish world. And his next volume, Young Zionist Voices, seeks to empower the Gen Zionist leaders standing up to bullies and inspiring the young Jewish generation with a Maccabean fighting spirit. What is the global war against the Jews, and how do we win it? Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
David Hazony, welcome to State of a Nation.
Thank you so much, Eylon, for having me on.
You, sir, are a prophet. You know that?
I didn't know that.
You know, speaking of nominative determinism, it comes with the name. I mean, Hazony literally means visionary, right?
Something like that.
I was going over your essay, The War Against the Jews. So, an essay that I read when you wrote it back in November, just a month after the October 7th massacre. I remember at the time wondering whether it was a little bit alarmist. Now I'm wondering whether you didn't go far enough. But it was definitely prophetic, a month after the massacre, to identify, as you wrote, while global Jewry has come together in unparalleled fashion to support Israel at its most difficult hour, there is nonetheless an important truth that many Jews are still finding hard to accept, or at least articulate. It is this: war has been launched against the Jewish people. What is this war, and when did it start?
Well, let's start with October 7th itself. I experienced October 7th as an Israeli. I live in Jerusalem. Like most Israelis, I knew personally people who had been harmed, killed, or taken captive through not one, but 4 or 5 different channels. And I was scheduled to fly to the United States on October 19th because of a book launch, which we'll go back to, I assume. And for a whole bunch of reasons, I ended up flying. Contrary to all my instincts, I ended up going to the US. And what I found in the United States was a community that was experiencing October 7th quite differently from Israel. In Israel, you had a few days of utter horror,
complete shock,
and fear,
right,
and not knowing where the terrorists were.
Took several days to clear them out of the kibbutzim.
But the moment we were sure the terrorists were out of the borders of our country, Israelis flipped a switch, mobilized, not simply at the military level, but also on the civilian level. And we all felt like we knew what we needed to do. When I came to the United States, I found a community that was, first of all, still reeling, scared. I heard the words scared and lonely a lot, and some degree of mobilization. But the mobilization was for Israel, raising money, getting gear for IDF troops. It was something that came out of a need to do something, but it didn't necessarily read the map correctly, in my view, at that moment. So I immediately felt like something's a little off here. We, as American Jews, are going to raise $1 billion, let's say, to rebuild the south of Israel, to support the IDF, which is wonderful, amazing. The Israeli government has an annual budget of about $140 billion a year. So it's real money, very helpful, but not necessarily facing the actual strategic danger facing the Jewish people. Because while Israel has an army, and it will defeat Hamas, and it will defeat Hezbollah, a massive war is being unleashed throughout the world against Jewish communities. And we see it not just on the campuses, we saw it in countries spanning from the United States to Dagestan and Turkey and the UK and Europe. And nobody in the Jewish community seemed to understand that massive resources, if they're going to be raised now, they need to go to the diaspora, to fighting a battle. In fact, the diaspora didn't even seem to understand that war had been launched against it. And so I felt very compelled already by the end of October. This piece came out November 7th. It was really a month after October 7th. So I wrote it in the week and a half before that because I felt that there was, once again, the Jews were responding through centuries of conditioning to anti-Semitism as something to be very terrified of, or something to ignore, and not something to figure out how do we fight.
So help me understand, for those for whom this concept of a global war against the Jews is still counterintuitive or seems somewhat alarmist, what is this war? What form is it taking? Who's waging it?
So it's really a vast coalition of different forces. Underneath it all, I do believe there is an anti-Semitic current that is eternal, that Jews...
Could a war against the Jews not be anti-Semitic?
Well, right, but it is underneath it all. There is a sort of eternal conspiracy theory against the Jew, who is perceived as having all of this power and is essentially the real place to put your blame when anything's going wrong in your life, and so on and so forth. It is classic anti-Semitism. More concretely, though, it is a coalition of forces. Some are Islamistic, some are Palestinian nationalist, some are you call woke or progressive, or but flowing out of the ideas that have been spawned by anti-colonialist thought and anti-Israel, anti-Zionist thought, and anti-apartheid, and all of these labels that essentially flow out of Western universities. We have a series of different movements who see it as advantageous to work together to essentially brand, first of all, Israel, second of all, the Jews, and third of all, Western civilization as an enemy to be defeated rather than a system to work within.
What are they concretely trying to achieve? Because I find this, in the context of Hamas's information war, the way that it is trying to maximize suffering inside Gaza, because it wants people to hate Israel. It wants to exploit naivety, complicity in the media, UN officials, to make people hate Israel so that they will join its global jihad against the Jews. But this global movement now that we're seeing, this uprising against the Jews, I mean, what is their end game? Because that is something we need to understand if we want to know how to organize against it.
Their end game is only power. Okay, when you have any movement that is an
power makes you an oppressor, and then you're the bad guy.
They don't think that far down the road.
They don't think that far down the road. Okay. Well, we need to think. We need to think longer.
Because if you think about all the revolutionary movements,
yes.
Okay, if you think about Cuba, or you think about all the movements that have any movement that begins with begins with hate, begins with we need to destroy, and then one day, okay, that doesn't really put resources into investing into an alternative, viable, good, that any movement like that ultimately doesn't really care what comes later. All they want to do is bring things down. And it doesn't matter if it's the Jews and their perception of power or the state of Israel.
Because look, they would say, we're against the state of Israel, we're not against the Jews, we want you to live within our societies, as they tell them to go back to Poland, right?
Right. They will use whatever terminology works with a given audience at a given moment. Okay, the tearing down posters of kidnapped children is not a way that you criticize the state of Israel.
And that was just the beginning. We're recording this just after. We can bring up this image now that shocked the whole Jewish world that we saw of the vandalization of the home of the director of the Brooklyn Museum. Vandalized with this upside down red triangle. Red paint smeared everywhere, calling her a white supremacist Zionist. That red triangle is the symbol that Hamas uses in its videos to mark out a target. This is not abuse. This is harassment. This is an explicit death threat against an American Jew. It comes on top of the horrific protest that we saw outside the scene of the Nova exhibition in New York, and they're doubling down on that. The keffiyeh-clad mobs chanting, "Where are the Zionists?" hunting for them on the New York subway. This is serious. I really think we're only a hair's breadth away from a political murder of a Jew in Europe or London or the United States. Some people don't quite seem to have clocked where we are. When did this start?
It started most flagrantly on October 7th, before Israel's retaliation. It started when protests spontaneously erupted in
That's
response.
the thing, it wasn't spontaneous. Where was this demon? Where was this demon in its bottle before it came out on October 7th?
It was in many organizations, many movements, many groups that were calling for boycott, divest, and sanctions against Israel, that were saying we're just criticizing Israel, we're not anti-Semitic. Many, whether it's Students for Justice in Palestine or
on October 7th, beginning to organize protests against Israel and in support of Hamas.
Well, first of all, these organizations existed well prior. Let's go back a little bit to the Second Intifada, because something I noticed during the Second Intifada, was that whenever there was a terror attack against Israel during the Second Intifada, if it was successful by their standards, it was immediately followed by protests throughout the West Bank.
And you have a nice word to describe this phenomenon.
Right. So I call it celebrieting, because
very good.
They are, on the one hand, violent, looking for a target. On the other hand, they're essentially celebratory. They're saying, we did it. We achieved something. We. Okay. So this eruption was, in a sense, spontaneous, in that the achievement of Hamas in their eyes was to hurt the Jews, to hit Israel. And all of these demonstrations that erupted, they came out of a desire to celebrate that achievement. Now, I used to think a long time ago that this was just a clever tactic to change the subject. We're going to hit you, and then we're going to, it's like I punch you in the face, and then I start screaming, he's trying to hurt me, before anyone can even react to the first crime. But what I saw on October 7th was something different, that it was deep down inside, these protests actually reflect a desire to kill Jews. In America, you can't get away with killing Jews yet. Okay, in America, there's an entire system in place to use euphemisms and somehow be able to spin your desire for blood through softer terms. But progressively, since October 7th, we've seen increased efforts to see what they can get away with. Okay? And what I write in the essay is that we have to understand that the only difference between these demonstrations and what we saw that Hamas did was a sense of what they can get away with, was a sense of how brave are they, brave in their terms, and what they feel that they can get away with. There is no moral distinction. Okay, there's no self-restraint. We have not seen self-restraint. They're not just burning Israeli flags, they're burning American flags. Okay, they're not just targeting actual self-proclaimed Zionist Jews. They're targeting Jews anywhere. synagogues, whatever. Okay, this is the same moral universe as Hamas. Okay, it puts all the blame, infinite blame, on the Jew. And it doesn't matter if it's a Jewish state or a Jewish community center or someone with a Jewish name.
So I want to unpack this because, of course, you still have people playing the game of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin about the differences between anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Oh, I don't actually hate the Jews, I hate Israel. Okay, I don't want to kill all the Jews, I only want to kill half the world's Jews, or the Jews who support it, which is most of them. After October 7th, how should we understand the essential link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Are they the same?
In ways that matter, yes. Okay, I have no patience for these games for the simple reason that any belief that says we are against this entire thing, it's not just anti-Jews, it's against the West, but Jews are an easy target. Jews are easy to label and to blame. Jews are easier because you don't trigger immediately the vast ire of the majority of America against you, which eventually they will. But their core belief is all this stuff, I'm going to tear it all down. And the Jews are number one because they're really behind it. They're the power, they're the money, they're so on and so forth. Israel has, I was in Washington for 4 years, from 2013 to 2016. And I remember having this really fascinating conversation with somebody at the Hudson Institute by the name of Michael Duran, very smart guy. He said, David, you're trying too hard to understand the motivations of all of these policy people. Fundamentally, they believe that Israel is the cause of all the problems in the Middle East. And if you've
not just the Middle East, the world, and that's why you see Israel, like Palestine, being labeled as a climate justice cause and police brutality cause and racial justice cause and everything else.
Look, there is no any belief system that starts with the real problem is the Jews, the real problem is the state of Israel. That if we just fix that, everything will be fine. That is at its core anti-Semitic. I don't care if you want to label it anti-Zionist, because in my view, call it anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionism is a problem no less than anti-Semitism. It's the same problem. It's the same conspiracy theory. It's the same worldview that says Israel's very existence, or the Jews' very existence, justifies all means necessary to resist, to fight, to protest.
Yes, and we don't really need to apologize for the crime of breathing while being Jewish. David, I want to ask you, it's been 8 months since the October 7 massacre as we record this episode, and when you started putting pen to paper with this very prophetic essay about the war against the Jews, I'm wondering, have you revisited any of your thoughts since then? Do you feel only vindicated? Are you looking around going, haha, I told you so? Or have you had some reflections about things you might have misplaced?
I'll tell you what's really developed in my thinking is the sense that diaspora Jews have not yet internalized the nature of the threat against them. They have not yet understood that this is a vast force that is arrayed for the sole purpose of excluding Jews, defaming Jews, and ultimately eliminating them from professional institutions, from academic institutions, from the public square, one step at a time. It's happening in many, many areas.
They are being purged.
They are being
purged, if only people who are paying a professional price for sticking their necks out and supporting Israel, losing clients, and that's even before you get to the universities that are refusing to admit Israeli students, the way that Jewish students and professors are being persecuted on American campuses.
There is an innate logic to this thinking. It does not stop with one group or another subgroup.
And you think that the diaspora doesn't get it? Because I mean, I've been inspired to see what I'm calling the Great Diaspora Awakening. Jews, call them October 7th Jews, who suddenly got a slap in the face and realized that they had to mobilize and take action, and they'd been ignoring this demon for too long. And to me, it looks like they get it, but you're less optimistic.
I don't yet see. I see a lot of beginnings. I see a lot of really noble efforts on the part, especially of young people, students in campuses who face the brunt of it, the harshest brunt of it. But you look at what you showed me before, the demonstration against the Nova screening and the Nova exhibit. And so forth. There's a really simple fundamental question. At what point do the Jews of New York prevail upon the city of New York to restore Jewish safety to New York City?
And that's not happening yet.
It has not happened yet.
No.
Maybe it's starting. Maybe there's an issue of a tipping point. We did see AOC come out with a tweet completely...
For which she has been absolutely pilloried for this tweet condemning the protesters outside the Nova exhibit. And you really see within this movement it beginning to devour itself. She's now getting called an apologist for genocide, for condemning the people protesting outside the exhibit.
She has a lot to be held to account for.
Oh, absolutely. Lies. She has been systematically spreading lies about Israel's conduct in that war. And when you tell the world that Israel and the Zionists are evil and they're the new Nazis, then people will take that to its logical conclusions.
That's right. I also look at politicians as for their political sense, to get a measure of the political instincts. And if she's starting to realize that the time has come to switch sides, that could be an indicator that the forces are starting to rally against these kinds of protests and against these. Look, eventually it will become clear to America as a whole that this is a force that threatens America as a whole. But America as a whole is looking at the Jews. They're saying how the Jews respond, if forcefully, if in a coherent way, if through the dedication of significant resources to fighting back. They're looking at the Jews to lead this fight.
So let's talk about how we respond and how we take this forward. In that very prophetic essay, you had one line. By the way, the whole essay is poetry, and I recommend people to read it. Magisterially written. This one line, I think,
is... The War Against the Jews.
The War Against the Jews in the Sapir Journal. This one line, more iconic than the others. You write, "Overcome the urge to hunker down and wait for the storm to pass. Stop acting like the benign ocean water that fuels the hurricane passing overhead. Instead, be the hurricane." And I think that was prophetic, not least because hurricane ended up being Israel's Eurovision entry and the de facto anthem of the Jewish resistance. What does it mean to be the hurricane?
I really wish I could take credit for the song becoming Hurricane.
Take it.
I do not yet have the data to confirm that. What it means is that if you want to fight a war, and if you want to think both like a warrior and like a war maker, a general, you need to ask the question, first of all, how do we upend the stability and organizational reality of the enemy? How do we take the fight to the enemy? How do we confuse the enemy? How do we quickly develop and battle test new ideas and new tactics? How do we communicate across many different fronts? How do we dedicate resources to things that are working so that they can be replicated elsewhere? It's essentially a rational strategic pose that the Jewish community as a whole must adopt. And
must adopt and must adapt.
Yes, and constantly changing. I mean, look, this is how battles how actual wars develop.
Not only to be responsive, but to take the initiative.
Taking initiative.
Wage battles of your own.
Learning from successes and failures. And we have many, many fronts for this to be taking place on, right? We've got things like the donor revolts. We've got legal channels, lawsuits. We've got simple counter-protesting tactics of different kinds. In the essay, I outline actually 8 points of what are the core fundamental elements.
We'll get onto those soon. But, some Jews think that being the hurricane means joining the storm that's already brewing. And we've seen a lot of Jews, a minority, but many of them, joining the protesters against Israel, the protesters on the side of Hamas. We saw, the Passover Seders taking place inside the Tentifadas, thinking that the way to overcome the storm is not to keep your head down, just to join the storm, and then at least you're getting blown in that direction. Has that strategy historically ever worked?
It might work for an individual who's too scared to join the fight for his own people. Yeah, and I think that over the course of history,
it's a survival strategy.
Many Jews have over the course of history, think back to the Spanish Inquisition and the debates, and all of that. Many Jews have
taken that out.
taken that way out.
And it worked for them as individuals.
On some level, perhaps not.
But
I don't know how they live with themselves. I don't know how they sleep well at night. I don't know how they see themselves as an example for their own kids and grandkids. There are many reasons why you should take up the fight, not least because of your own sense of self-value. It's a spiritual mandate before anything else to know that you undertook the fight for your people.
And I think we're seeing this awakening, especially among young people. I call them Gen Zionists. Mm-hmm. These are not Gen Z. These are the young adults who, like many young Israelis on October 7th, realize the adults are not in the room. They're not going to swoop in and save them. They need to take their proverbial weapons, go into battle, start fighting. You're seeing this within America. What are you noticing among young Americans, other Jews around the diaspora, in terms of a willingness to realize that the Jewish people are at war and they need to take up arms?
I think that you're seeing, first of all, the American Jewish community is very multifaceted. It's a combination of different immigrations that came in over a period of centuries, beginning with Sephardic Jews who came in the early 18th century, then the German Jews who created many of the basic core institutions, and then Eastern European Jews who came in large numbers at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And since then, more recently, you also have Jews from the former Soviet Union. Mm. You have Jews from Israel. Okay, you have 500,000 Israeli Americans now.
As many as that.
As many as that.
That's where they've gone. We need them back.
You've got and Jews from Latin America who come to the United States. So you have on the one hand generations of Jews. It's sort of like an archaeological site, layers upon layers and each immigrant community has different experiences, different approaches. So, for example, the Germans who came in the 19th century were very assimilationist. Their entire view was to cut off any ties to the old Jewish nationalism and the old right, that they would, through the Reform movement.
And they would reframe Judaism as being exclusively a religion.
That's right.
Not perhaps the best strategy to take when the world was moving towards less religion. And then if you say Judaism is only a religion, and you don't want religion, then you're left with nothing and only assimilation.
But in the United States, in the First Amendment, religion is protected. So that was one of the core motivations. With the early immigrants from Eastern Europe, you also had a very strong desire just to make it in America, to find security and prosperity. But what you have now is a new generation where so much of the response to October 7th is being driven, if you look carefully, by children of Israelis, children of former Soviet immigrants, children of Latin American immigrants who don't necessarily have the same welded fear responses. And
fascinating.
And so I'm discovering this because we're putting together right now a collection of essays called Young Zionist Voices, which I'm very happy to announce and tell the world about, especially because it has a foreword in it written by Eylon Levy.
Does it really? I really need to write it.
But what I'm discovering is, and the purpose of this was to offer an opportunity to bring young Jews together into a single volume to show the world that there is a coherent thought leadership, and to show young Jews elsewhere who might feel disconnected or alone that they have real thought leaders to look towards.
Who are not afraid or ashamed of the word Zionist and take pride and ownership of it.
That's right. And so some of the names might be familiar. You've been following all the campus stuff. Some of these are students who've played prominent roles. Some of them are Israelis. Some of them come from Europe. Really fascinating collection. What I'm seeing is a real desire. Here's the thing. It's not just about Israel. It's not just about defending Israel. It is, a few years back, I wrote an essay called Aliyiah of the Mind, where I made the argument that Zionism doesn't need physical aliyah so much anymore. What we need is aliyah of the mind. What we need is the internalization of the core critique that the early Zionist thinkers brought against diaspora life, about what it does spiritually to the Jew to be in a permanent state of exile. And
does aliyah of the mind mean that they pay their tax revenues to Israel as well, or they get to make aliyah without paying us their taxes?
I'll leave to the absorption ministry to figure out. But
yes, what does it mean, this aliyah of the mind?
Aliyah of the mind means, it's similar to what today is called Jewish pride. It means if you're under attack, you fight back. Okay, that's the immediate response. Because if you don't fight back, you're going to just invite much, much more attack. Okay.
And then if you're talking about the response being fight or flight, if you don't fight, there is nowhere to flight to, right, because you are under attack on all fronts.
Right. There's also something deeper here. It means self-educating. It means the first step is to say, I am a Jew. What on earth does that mean? Okay, that's a process. It means delving into ancient texts. It means learning the 3,000-year history of your people. Not just 2,000, but 3,000.
3.5.
Okay, well, let's keep going. It means that every single Jew is a sovereign owner of the Jewish heritage, and that if your entire Jewish worldview comes down to Holocaust and the State of Israel, which is to say essentially a 10-year period in the middle of the 20th century, then you're actually missing out on incredible depth and richness of who you are.
Realizing that you are an heir to a magnificent transnational civilization,
yes,
and not only 10 years of catastrophe to resurrection in the 20th century.
And that as an heir, you also have a responsibility to that heritage. And so every single person can bring that upon themselves, and as soon as they do, it just fundamentally changes the dynamic of what October 7th means and what the response to October 7th actually means, because the Jewish people aren't going anywhere. We can either hide and say, oh no, it's a pogrom, we are helpless, or we can put together our resources and strategize and fight this fight properly.
And I imagine as part of the young Zionist voices, this collection you're putting together, and it's so important to elevate young leaders as well, there has to be a reckoning, and a reckoning not only against the institutions in society that have allowed this horrific anti-Semitism to emerge, but also against legacy Jewish organizations that have, I mean, clearly whatever strategy they were pursuing over the last quarter century to keep American Jews safe has failed, and there needs to be a reckoning against that too, from the young.
So, when October 7th happened, almost every single Israeli immediately recognized that their own leaders had failed them. Okay, Israel is going through and will go through a reckoning about intelligence, military, and the political leadership. What has not yet been fully internalized among diaspora Jews, and especially among American Jews, is the extent to which their own leadership similarly failed them. For a century, American Jewish Jews have enjoyed these massive organizations called defense organizations, the entire purpose of which was to identify and fight anti-Semitism and prevent the feelings that Jews have right now. Suddenly there's this radical emergence of anti-Semitism that American Jewish institutions simply failed to detect, failed to fight against. And if you look back, only a few months before October 7th, the debate over what's more dangerous, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism, across the board, the mainstream position was, we still have to look to right-wing anti-Semitism as the real threat. Now, in the book Jewish Priorities, which was the book that I was launching when I came to America, it's a collection of 65 essays, that all of which were obviously written before October 7th. They were all written mostly in 2022. We have one of the most prophetic pieces in there is by David L. Bernstein, the author of Woke Anti-Semitism. It's called Confronting the New Cossacks. Now, the way he describes it is that every Jewish community, when it comes to a new country, the first question they ask is, okay, who are the Cossacks here? Who are the people that I need to be most aware of as potentially sources of pogroms, of devastation to our community? And we need to build, and in America, they identified the right wing, especially the believing right-wing Christians, as the ultimate potential Cossacks in America. If you look across the 20th century, how American Jewish public involvement developed, it was all coordinated in a way that keeps the Cossacks at bay and maximizes the likelihood of Jewish prosperity and Jewish success, whether it's fighting for workers' rights or fighting for civil rights or fighting for gay rights. All of these movements and all of these organizations that the Jews invested themselves in were essentially built to preserve the public square, among other things, both to give America its true Americanness, but also to keep Jews safe. What happens when it turns out the Cossacks are actually in the progressive movement, or the most dangerous ones? How much does that undermine the entire structure of American Jewish life, the layer upon layer upon layer of organizations that have been built? There needs to be a reckoning. There needs to be a fundamental challenging of the legacy institutions, not just to place blame, because I think that it's deep. The problem is deeper than that, but to ask what are the structures we're going to need moving forward? How do we reinvent core American Jewish life and diaspora Jewish life more broadly, in the wake of the fact that the progressive movement is filled with Cossacks?
It's fascinating to hear you talk about, just like on October 7th, Israel had its own systems failure, which was a combination of intelligence and military and political leadership failure, that American Jewry has had the same thing and failed so spectacularly in foreseeing the threat that they are now really scrambling to deal with. And I'm wondering, what are the obstacles, not only to this reckoning that now, at least within American Jewish society, people get it or beginning to get it, but more broadly around the world within American society, helping people understand the nature of the war against the Jews? What are the obstacles that mean that people are still in denial about the extent of the threat that we face?
People don't want to believe that when I give money to a college, to my alma mater, I'm actually helping the enemies of our people. They don't want to believe that. Okay, and it doesn't matter that quietly and carefully, under the rubric of academic freedom, these forces have been massing through books, through ideologies, through curricula, through slowly conquering different fields of inquiry, and have been taking over academia in a way that physically puts Jews at risk. It's something that is so contrary to their lifelong habits of how to be a good Jew in America that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a long time. It comes down to, look, American Jews, so much of American Jewish life surrounds the act of philanthropy, okay? Because American Jews are perhaps the most prosperous Jewish community in the history of the world, and much of their activism and their place in the world is expressed through philanthropy. The fundamental habits of philanthropy have to change because they didn't work. They didn't protect the Jews. Okay.
How do you see them reorienting their philanthropic priorities then to help this fight back?
Well, first of all,
what do they need to invest in?
First of all, they need to invest, and I put down an 8-point plan there in the piece, but I'll touch on just a couple of them. Number one is security. Okay, security of all communities, all Jews everywhere.
Security, you mean putting more patrols outside synagogues, or security as in making sure that every American Jewish teenager is proficient in Krav Maga?
I think all of the above. I think that there's also a lot of intercommunal communication, comparison, trial and error, tactical sharing. Security is intelligence gathering. Security is a very, very broad thing that is only somewhat been really invested in. There are efforts underway to cover different pieces of it. I know that in the United States now they have something called CSS that is working to ensure, and obviously working with state and local law enforcement authorities. But all of these are different pieces of a security puzzle that must be invested in. That's number one. Number two is knowing who your enemies are, identifying, recognizing that they're working together. Number 3 is knowing who your allies are. Jews have an unfortunate instinct to assume they are alone when they're often not. That,
I mean, they are alone in the sense that they simply, at least on campuses, have not been cultivating the alliances that they need in order to fight back. When I speak to students and they ask me, what should we do? I say, make friends, but make friends not as individuals, make friends as a community. Have a joint Shabbat dinner with the local Christian chapter. And then say, hey, we're going out to put out hostage posters. Do you mind watching my back while I put up hostage posters? You can make friends with the Indians, the Iranians. The Iranians.
This is 100% right, especially the Iranians who have so much, who share the urgency with us. Absolutely, 100%. That's exactly right. I think that part of the community, and this is something that I've been dealing with for a very long time, this is a battle of ideologies. Okay, what we are seeing erupt, all of these weird words that don't make any sense to us, apartheid and colonialism and power structures and does DEI fit into this in some way? And why are we oppressors? We're Jews. We're the most oppressed people in the history of humanity. How did we become the oppressor? White? Really? We fought so hard to, because we weren't white.
Or considered even human.
Or even considered even human. So all of these terms and labels and weird things, they all come out of a coherent ideology that was developed over decades and generations.
Namely, wokeism?
What?
Post-colonialism? What are we calling it?
It has different names.
Antisemitism.
Okay, you had Isabel Toborowski on your show, who's also in Jewish Priorities, by the way. She covers the...
We're working through the contributors to Jewish Priorities one by one until we have 65 episodes.
That's right. So part of it was, in fact, a deliberate Soviet strategy in the wake of the Six-Day War. Israel won the Six-Day War, defeated the Arab states. Arab states were clients of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were very bothered by this. And they turned fighting against Zionism into a major wedge issue that they tried to insert into Western discourse through pamphlets in English in millions and millions of copies with titles like Zionism is colonialism and Israel is apartheid. In the early 1970s, this I learned from Isabella, okay, full credit to her. So that's one part of it. There is, yes, the Frantz Fanon and the Edward Said and the Rashid Khalidi, all of these thinkers of anti-colonialism and anti-Westernism who found it convenient to focus on Israel as this ultimate evil. Okay, one by one, book by book, whether they were written in Moscow or Paris or Morningside Heights in New York City, these books built a worldview that challenges not just...
An ideological superstructure, you might say.
An ideological superstructure that challenges not just Jewish legitimacy and not just the state of Israel, but the West as a whole, Western liberalism as a whole. And so you hear these preposterous statements about how science is actually, a structure of oppression, and footnotes are actually, and we laugh and we think it's funny, but it's actually coherent. It's actually well planned and built, and it's actually taking over. And until we realize this threat, until we mobilize against this threat, and as I said before, the non-Jews are looking at the Jews to say, will they fight back? Do they understand the extent of this threat? We can't wait for them to come and save us, just like we can't wait for legacy Jewish institutions
No.
to come and save us.
The Jews have to wake up, and I see part of my role now as helping to essentially instigate a diaspora revolt, to shake people by the shoulders and say, you need to wake up and fight back.
Look, I hate to be the one to say I told you so. I hate that. But for 30
You don't. That smile on your face, you don't hate saying I told you so. You're relishing
I
it.
do. I'm not relishing it. For 30 years, I've been watching this happen. Watching as a very few small, isolated voices, people like Martin Kramer, who wrote a book called Ivory Towers on Sand about the takeover of Middle Eastern studies. 25 years ago, he wrote this book. There were people who called it out. There were people who protested. And going to Jewish donors in America and saying they're building a massive intellectual army against us, and being told, the house is burning down. The house is on fire. We don't have time for books. Like, what we need is PR. What we need is ads. What we need is billboards. And we have to understand that a war that was launched through books will not be defeated with billboards. It doesn't work that way.
And that's one, I find the hardest question that I get asked in interviews. Is the whole world wrong? The UN, the Red Cross, the Special Rapporteur for whatever, the World Food Programme, they're all saying this. And you're the only ones who are right? And to explain that actually, yes, sometimes we are talking about institutions that have been hijacked by this radical ideological agenda and captured over very many years and weaponized and mobilized against the Jews. Yes, they are wrong, and it wouldn't be the first time that the world has done that. Now, I think as part of this diaspora revolt, great diaspora awakening, whatever we're calling it, it's so important to strengthen the relations with Israel. And for many years, we heard from people in the diaspora, perhaps a slightly condescending attitude about what Israelis need to know and need to learn. And I'm wondering whether the other way around, what do you think now that as diaspora Jews discover that Maccabean fighting spirit, they can actually learn from Israelis in the way they responded on October 7th?
You just asked a large number of questions, and I hope I can recall all of them.
Pick one.
The phrase, the whole world is against us, is a phrase that comes out of centuries of Jewish fear, because it's not actually true. First of all, there is no whole world. Okay, there are governments which have actual power. There are bodies like the UN, which actually are a million different sub-organizations which have different things going on. Did you know that after the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union and all of its satellite states cut ties with Israel? This is after the Arab states had no ties with Israel at all. In the late 1960s, 1970s, Israel had diplomatic relations with a minority of the nations.
We have been more isolated.
How many countries have cut diplomatic ties entirely with Israel since October 7th?
Colombia.
One.
Maldives didn't have diplomatic relations, but they're now not having Israeli
cutting
passport.
Diplomatic relations.
How many?
I'm aware of three.
Three? Colombia,
Okay.
what am I missing?
Bolivia
Bolivia.
and South Africa.
And South Africa.
Okay. Israel's standing is actually surprisingly strong. Israel is, first of all, the very fact that 8 months in, we're still able to fight a war without massive sanctions, that's unprecedented. Leave aside the fact that the United States is still the most powerful country on earth and 80% of Americans are on our side in this war. Germany, France.
Yes, only
United
20%
Kingdom.
of Americans are on the side of Hamas. What a relief.
It is. It should be a relief. Because
It's shocking.
Because it's not the whole world. Okay. Second of all, the world is built, to the extent that it's built at all, to the extent that it's not just a total jungle, is it built on the assumption that sovereign states have a right to defend themselves and have a right, therefore, to choose whether they're right or wrong and to stand up against it. We Jews come from a tradition thousands of years long where we believe that justice is about standing up against the mob. Okay, and it's repeated over and over throughout the Torah and the Bible that justice means don't go with the mob, even if you're the lone voice, because the future of humanity depends on the possibility of people seeing justice as something against what the mob does. The mob is just what animals do. Okay, it's violence, it's the jungle, and it's the natural state of what human beings do is they sense which way the wind is blowing and they just go with the mob. To be a Jew is always to resist the mob, which is why I love to say that Zionism is the resistance. Okay, we're standing up against, the more we stand up against the world, the more we are fulfilling our destiny as Jews.
And on that note, it seems like the Jewish people are in need of some new superheroes. And in fact, many superhero stories are actually inspired by the Jewish narrative throughout history, have they not?
I think so. I think a lot of the comics industry.
Tell me about your Zionist interpretation of The Incredibles.
So this is about 20 years ago, I guess, after the movie The Incredibles came out.
Has it been that long?
It's been a long time.
Wow.
I don't know the exact date.
I'm not young anymore.
It could be 15 years. I don't know. And I apologize to the audience for not Googling the release date of The Incredibles, but it was a while back. I was just very taken by this tale because I know that superhero stories in general, they do have a Jewish history to them, Marvel Comics, the DC Comics, and so forth. But here it seemed so acutely Zionist in its core storytelling. You have a family with superpowers, right? The super. If you haven't seen the movie, the superheroes are a whole layer of society, and at a certain point, everybody turns against them, and they have to go underground. Some are killed, some are disavow it entirely, but for the most part, they just maintain their identities as a secret. Okay, the Incredibles is about one family of superheroes, where each member of the family has different special superpowers that forever have been told to keep secret. But at a certain point, there arises an evil that requires that they, go public. They take the father captive. The rest of the family has to go, and in doing so, they have to not just go public with their powers, but also rediscover their powers. The kids don't necessarily know how to use their powers. And I always felt like this is exactly what Jewish sovereignty, reclaiming Jewish sovereignty after thousands of years in exile, is really about. It's about a family that has deep inside of it, that's been keeping secret for a very, very long time, what it really can bring to the world. Okay, and because Jewish, if you read through the Bible, you'll see that to be a Jew, first of all, assumes a sovereign reality, assumes that we can actually live a full life with our understanding of justice and our understanding of how to make the world better, expressed through a sovereign nation, and to finally be able not only be able to come out, as it were, but also to have to, because of the immense evil that we suddenly face. So the Holocaust was the greatest evil the world has ever seen. And it's not a coincidence that Jews felt finally, we have no choice. We have to emerge as superheroes.
I love that, and I love, so you know what, if you've already connected The Incredibles so beautifully to the Jewish story, let's try to connect some other modern day Jewish heroes to superhuman, superhero narratives. We've linked a few of my personal Jewish heroes to superheroes. I want you to talk us through the archetypes of these superheroes and how they connect to the Jewish story today. First up, we have Deborah Messing, Wonder Woman. Why is Deborah Messing our new Wonder Woman?
Look, what I love about Wonder Woman, there is a land where she comes from, where sort of everybody has, again, the superpowers and so forth. And that she has to go out into the rest of the world and fight using what she has, but there is all the while there's this assumption and belief that there is some kind of an alternate ideal that could be very real. Okay, for Jews, that is the land, and Deborah Messing has been an amazing fighter for the Jewish people and for understanding that the flag of Israel is not just a flag; it's an actual country with beautiful people in it and a beautiful ideal to try to bring into reality of prosperity and justice and not all of these fake, crazy, weird words that we're fighting against. And she's been amazing. She's been just an incredible fighter. So yeah.
She's been a real Wonder Woman.
Yeah, absolutely.
After actress Deborah Messing, we have our next Jewish superhero for the 21st century, Spider-Woman Mia Lemberg, one of the hostages famously released in the only hostage deal we've had. Please God, we'll have another one by the time this episode is aired, who escaped Hamas captivity together with her dog Bella. Why is she a superhero for us?
Look, what's amazing about Spider-Man is Peter Parker is just such an ordinary, humble guy. Okay, he didn't want to be Spider-Man. He didn't want to get bit by the spider. He didn't want to have to fight. He didn't want any of this. But once thrust upon him, that responsibility, it's something that he knows how to take upon himself. And Mia is amazing. Like, I just saw a whole interview with her on Israeli television, and she really embodies this sort of, none of us want to be in this position. None of us wanted October 7th. None of us wanted to have to take off our ordinary citizen costumes and reveal our superpowers. None of us wanted it. And if we had to do it over again, we'd much rather not have had October 7th and not have had to reveal that who we truly are. But Mia is just completely, in my view, typifies She's like the Peter Parker of Israel.
Beautiful. Our next Jewish superhero is Superman Arnon Zamora of blessed memory, the only Israeli casualty from the heroic, inspirational rescue mission that liberated Noah Argamani and 3 other hostages from Hamas captivity inside Gaza. I hope every city in this country names a square and a street, and that American Jewish institutions idolize this hero of a man as New Judah Maccabee. Tell me why he's our Superman.
Superman is immense strength, but also a weakness, right? Superman, you think of the muscles and you think of the kryptonite. All of us are, at the same time, have revealed incredible spiritual strength, especially the younger generation, especially both in Israel and on the campuses in America. Incredible fortitude. But we have kryptonite. Okay, we have, and for our fighters, it's the fact that they're still flesh and blood, still permeable, still can be killed in battle. For Jews more broadly, our kryptonite is often something else. It's often our humanity. It's often our unwillingness to go down the path that our enemies go down. It's something that leaves us vulnerable and potentially fatally so. So I think Superman is an amazing analogy for what has been revealed lately. I think that he is an incredible hero to represent Superman, and unfortunately he's not with us anymore to get the award.
But also because Superman has these 2 identities. There's Clark Kent, the civilian, Superman, the hero. And his wife said, look, he was the hero of Israel, but I want him to be remembered, first of all, as an amazing husband and father who had a normal life with a normal family and then has to put on uniform and become a hero.
Yep.
Our next Jewish superhero to round us off is Batman Shai Davidai. Why is Shai, who is being politically persecuted on Columbia's campus, leading the charge against Columbia's faculty and what they are doing to Jewish students there? Why is he our Batman?
Look, the thing about Batman is that he has no superpowers. Batman's the only superhero who doesn't have powers. All he has is resources, gadgets, his mind. Okay? And so I've always found Batman to be just absolutely fascinating in that regard, because anybody could be Batman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Shai has done incredible work, sometimes all alone, fighting against Columbia University, which I also attended many years ago.
Not something to be proud of, David.
I am saying it as a confessional more than anything else. And I think that by pointing out that he's Batman, you're pointing out that he's just a person doing things that appear to be superhuman, but really every single person could be doing. Everybody can stand up. And the more people stand up together, the much more powerful it will be. So Shai stuck his neck out there, put his entire career on the line. Okay, and people should follow him, and people should join with him, and many have. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to him and to all of the superheroes.
Absolutely, more power to all of them. David, it's been 7 months now since you wrote this seminal essay in Sapir Journal, The War Against the Jews. War has been declared on the Jewish people. How have you been mobilizing since then to help return battle?
Look, I mentioned before that the issue of books is one that's very dear to me. The issue of not just, books can be extremely alive and vibrant, or they can be dead and useless. But so many of the ideas that have motivated us over the past, through my lifetime, have emerged from books. I'll take, we see the example on the other side of all of these phrases and all these terminologies that all come out of the works of scholars and thinkers. But on our side as well, you take a book like Startup Nation, right? Dan Senor and Saul Singer published a book called Startup Nation, and in an instant, added an entire new interpretive lens that raced across our community and far beyond our community of how to understand what Israel is. Before Startup Nation, Israel was, the only democracy in the Middle East, was David against Goliath, was the one Jewish state in the world, shared values, and all of that. nobody had taken together all of the different incredible innovations that were happening and said, wait a minute, Israel is also this incredible force of technological good in the world. And it was all captured in this one phrase that was repeated endlessly by people who never read the book and never bought the book.
And has now become the country's brand.
And it's now become the country's brand. Okay, so that all began with a book. Or take Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. Okay, again, capture.
I think she made a terrible mistake, and there was a typo, and the title should have been People Love Dead Jews Dead, actually.
Right. Well, she came out of nowhere in our world, and with a single line, it managed to capture something so many people had been feeling and into a single phrase. This is a world that we call public intellectuals, okay? People who become stars and can be a constant force of new, good, interesting ideas and development of interpretive lenses that help us understand our world better and prepare us to fight better. I was invited by something called the Z3 Project, which is this amazing effort out of the JCC, the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California. The Z3 is headed by Amitai Freiman. So they have this annual conference, which is one of the places where Jewish Priorities was being launched each year in November in Palo Alto. What I didn't know when I started speaking to them was that they've also developed something called a leadership lab, which is a very widespread network of Jewish communal institutions.
Leadership lab?
Leadership
where
lab.
We'll try to grow leaders in petri dishes.
If you will. Which is leaders of Jewish community centers and youth groups and many different nationwide networks that come together the second day of the conference and also all throughout the year and learn about Zionism and Jewish pride and how to implement these things, because so much of what's missing is technical and implementational and tactical rather than just conceptual. And they've invited me to add a third segment. We have the conference, we have the leadership labs, and they invited me to help set up a new think tank, which we're calling the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities, where we will identify new thinkers, new ideas, new books, and help give them the tools they need to succeed, both in the public discourse and also specifically injected into the Jewish communal discourse. So we're going to have a few announcements in the coming months. I don't know exactly when this will be. Will go live.
This episode will be timeless.
But let's just say that stay tuned. We're going to have a few really amazing fellows that will be joining the Institute shortly. We have the Young Zionist Voices book project that's going to be coming out in very end of 2024 or early 2025. We will be involved in a whole series of fascinating projects, the purpose of which is to actually do the reckoning that we were talking about, to actually ask the hard questions, to challenge at the levels of philanthropy, education, Zionism, U.S.-Israel relations, and on all the different pieces of what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century.
An inflection point in our history, and I'm so glad that someone is thinking ahead. War has been declared on the Jews. We're in it to win it, and we'll do it with what we've always been best at, which is words. And the pen, which is mightier than the sword. We still need the sword, but time to pick up our pens as well. David Hazony, thank you very much for coming on State of a Nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with David Hazony. As always, if you're enjoying these episodes, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe and follow us on all social media platforms. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining.